Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome to Ecologics Arctic Summer College session number 2. This week I welcome you from Ecologic Berlin. My name is Arne Riedel and we've briefly met last week already. I hope you can hear me all fine, and if there should be any issues, just let us know in the chat box and we'll try to respond as quickly as possible. First of all, welcome and thank you to our presenters today to join us and to be willing to share their knowledge with us. We are very happy to have Emily McKenzie and Katherine Wyatt from WWF and the University of Stanford, respectively, as well as Nils Andreassen from the Institute of the North with us. So welcome all of you. Maybe you can say quickly hi. So
thank you.
Yes,
thanks very much. Hi.
Great. So I can hear you just fine. I hope our audience can hear you fine just as well. In case you are wondering that you cannot see me, unfortunately we have some apparently update issues with the most recent version of the webinar software, which yesterday still allowed me to share my webcam, but unfortunately today it doesn't. So it's a very unfortunate event, and I've been trying the last 40 minutes to fix it, but as there was no quick fix, we'll have to try to come back on that with an image from myself next week. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to share the presentations and share the presentations by our experts. So let's dive right in and let's start the webinar. So let me just quickly remind you of one more thing. Thank you to all of you who have already sent your abstracts for your contributions to the Arctic Summer College this year. Just to remind you of the deadline, that is the 19th of July. So for those of you who haven't sent anything yet, feel free to do so, and we're looking forward to your abstracts. One more sort of teaser to strike your interest as well. As my colleagues last week already announced, we will pick from these, based on the abstracts and the final versions, we will pick 3 fellows of this year to join us at the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik in Iceland. And to add on that, we just got finalized today the confirmation of the publishing of our Arctic Summer College yearbook with contributions from the last 2 years of fellows contributions. So we actually look forward to continue this cooperation with Springer and hope to be able to publish another version of this yearbook next year. So another incentive maybe for you to work towards that contribution. All right, so much for the preface. Let me just give you the titles and topics of today's presentations. We will be starting today with Emily McKenzie and Katherine Wyatt's presentation. It's about understanding ecosystem services and the changing climate for sustainable decision making in the Arctic. It will also present a case example that Katherine and Emily have worked on specifically. We will then follow the first presentation with a discussion on that presentation due to some time constraints of our presenters. And then after the first Q&A, we will have the second presentation by Nils Andreassen on Alaska, Arctic and sustainable development, and also then followed by a Q&A session. All right, I hope that was understandable. And let me see if I can start our recording here. And then we should be able to start. I will make Emily the presenter right now, and then the floor is yours, Emily. All right, there we go.
Okay, great. Are you seeing my screen okay?
Yes, wonderful.
Excellent, and hearing me okay. So just let me know if you're not hearing or seeing things right. So thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity to share some ideas with you today. Katherine and I are part of a bigger team that includes the WWF Arctic program, and other colleagues at Stanford University and the University of Washington. And many of them have a lot more experience in the Arctic than Katherine and I do. We're on a steep learning curve. And so we're hoping this will be a two-way exchange. We'll be sharing some ideas and case studies from outside of the Arctic and some early work we've done scoping and building towards using these approaches in the Arctic. But we're really looking forward to the Q&A session and hope we can really have a lot of exchange and learning from you as well. So, and I believe that you'll be having a talk later this year by Sasha Shostakov, who is the director of the WWF Arctic program, so you'll learn more from him. I'm just going to put my watch where I can see it to track time. So Katherine and I are going to do this as a shared presentation, and we want to cover four things. I'll start by just laying out what we see as the challenge of future infrastructure development in the Arctic in the context of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And then we're going to give an overview of this concept of natural capital, although one of the first things we've learned in the Arctic is that natural assets is probably a better term. But however we call it, we'll look at these approaches, and then we want to illustrate it, and I'll hand to Katherine, with a real example far, far away from the Arctic, the Bahamas. But we've picked this example, even though it's from a very different context, because we think it's a recent example that illustrates the power of the approach, not only the science, but the approach of engagement in these kinds of activities. And then finally, I'll conclude by laying out what we've been doing over the last few years to build a foundation for co-developing and applying these approaches to improve decision-making in the Arctic, possibly starting with infrastructure to begin with. So just to begin with, though, before I go into the presentation itself, I just thought it might be helpful for those of you who are new to the organizations that we represent to just give you a little bit of a backdrop of who we are. So I work for WWF. And WWF has a large number of offices in the Arctic. So we have a presence in all of the 7 Arctic countries, except Iceland, and have worked on SOCOM polar issues since 1992. And the work in the Arctic is part of a global network of over 100 countries of WWF. And so many of the non-Arctic countries, like the UK, where I am based, and the Netherlands and others, are very engaged with our Arctic program. And this is where I refer to one of the handouts that's on your list. I think Anna's probably uploading them gradually, is the Global Arctic Program fact sheet, which is probably a bit out of date now. We've just been renewing our WWF Arctic Strategic Plan, which, if I'm right in thinking Sasha's talking to you, I'm sure he'll give you an overview of, but it gives the basics of what WWF does in the region. And then the other organization we're representing is a partnership, which includes WWF, but 3 other organizations, another large conservation NGO, the Nature Conservancy, and then 2 universities in the US, Stanford University and the University of Minnesota. And this partnership's been going since 2005. And the 4 leaders in the 4 organizations came together around this idea of accounting for how nature benefits people in decision making. And we have, our strategy is focused on using these approaches in decision making around these 5 shared outcomes: sustainable development, securing fresh water, sustainable cities, standards for the private sector, and safe and resilient coastal communities, which are closely interlinked. So that's a little bit. Happy in the Q&A to give you any more information about who we are and what we do, but just to set the scene. So now to dive into the presentation itself. In the first part, we just wanted to lay out what we are seeing as this set of opportunities and challenges that come from the expected infrastructure development in the Arctic region. So this slide shows a headline that came out in January last year. The world has discovered $1 trillion ocean. Another striking headline that came out around the same time was Arctic investment is the best opportunity of the last 12,000 years. And what these media attention reflects is that that the Arctic is an increasingly attractive area for investors and governments who are seeking to develop. And new investments in infrastructure are expected to reach up to 1 trillion, according to Guggenheim Partners, who are a major investment firm in the region, so $1 trillion by 2030. And so if these predictions are correct, there's a significant amount of financial investment that will expand marine and land-based industries and the infrastructure that's required to support them. So that includes things like new ports, airports, shipping operations, tourism operations, fishing fleets, and so on. So this is the Arctic that is expected in the future. And so, as I'm sure you're all very familiar, the Sustainable Development Goals are the goals that the national governments from all around the world have agreed represent what we want to achieve in terms of sustainable development, including the Arctic nations. And so this leads to the question of how can we do this infrastructure development, and Sustainable Development Goal number 9 relates specifically to infrastructure development, but do it in a holistic fashion that recognizes the importance of all of these goals, how they're interconnected, and that we can't focus on infrastructure narrowly without thinking about how it itself depends on life on land. For example, how ecosystems and biodiversity protect infrastructure from erosion and flooding, and so on. So we're really looking for a way of making decisions that can achieve the SDGs while building this infrastructure, which is a very important, vital part of the sustainable development we want globally and in the Arctic region. And just to illustrate this interconnection, I really like this way of visualizing the SDGs. This comes from the Stockholm Resilience Center, and I heard that Rockström actually proposed this to Ban Ki-moon as the way to portray the SDGs, but it didn't go through. Instead, we have the more kind of just boxes way of portraying it. But I like this way of showing how these goals that relate to the economy, to partnerships, and to society sit within the context of the boundaries of our planet, the biosphere, and that the healthy operation of the environment is vital to achieving the other SDGs. And so in that context, WWF has been doing a lot of work around sort of high-level advocacy for sustainable economies. We use the term sustainable blue economy. I'm showing this visual of some principles developed by WWF for principles for a sustainable blue economy, which is very relevant in the Arctic. Maybe it should be white economy, I'm not sure. Also green economy, but however we call it, we're looking for economic development that provides social and economic benefits for the current generation and future generations. And that means economies that restore and protect and maintain these diverse, productive, and resilient ecosystems, natural assets that benefit us, and are based on clean technologies, renewable energy, and circular flows. And so in that bigger context of the changes that are expected in the Arctic and what we're trying to achieve in the region and globally, we'd like to focus on the power and potential of what is called often in the community natural capital approaches. We can reframe and relabel it in many ways. The term capital can, for some communities, be very off-putting if it's associated with capitalism, or leads to a confusion that value means price, which it doesn't. So this term can, and potentially in the Arctic, can lead to misunderstanding, so we need to be careful. But for the purpose of this webinar, hopefully it won't put you off. We can go into the nuances in the Q&A. And what we see through these approaches is a very practical, applied ways of drawing on science and having really extensive engagement with partners and communities, businesses, and stakeholders to achieve the SDGs, which when they are put up on the screen there look a little vague, but when you get to the ground are real tangible things. And what we can use these approaches for is really measuring and holding ourselves accountable for contributions from all members of society to restoring and enhancing and protecting them. So ecosystem services can be many, many things. They can include a whole range, in their essence, of benefits that people get from from the environment, things like tourism and recreation, protection of communities who live near coastlines, which might be susceptible to storms or erosion, the provision of regular and clean water supply. So really tangible things, food and fisheries, but also all the way through to the less tangible but potentially more important spiritual and aesthetic and community connections that fulfill us in our daily lives through connection with nature. So this term ecosystem services is this flow of benefits that crosses a whole range of different ways we interact with and benefit from the environment. And those ecosystem services, those benefits, depend on a range of different types of connected capitals. And that includes, if we take, for example, fish, the benefit of fish for food, for nutrition, and I guess the community connection that comes through lifestyles of fisheries. That depends on the skills and experiences that depends on fish stocks themselves that you've got here. That's a form of natural capital. On healthy habitats, like you're seeing here, healthy river ecosystems that support those fisheries. On fishing vessels like this, which is manufactured capital, built capital. And the skills of fishermen themselves in knowing how to catch those fish, we call that social capital, human capital, and then the systems of governance of people operating together and trusting each other in order to gain those benefits, known as social capital. And so it can sound, when you show it in a diagram like this, a bit kind of jargony and not very tangible. But what we're really talking about is the connections of all different types of capital, including natural capital, as its kind of core foundation for supplying all these different benefits. And we don't want to burden you with jargon and too many dry frameworks, but this is what's becoming sort of a standard definition of natural capital, as put forward by the Natural Capital Coalition, which is a coalition of over 250 organizations working in this area. So the natural capital is this stock of renewable and non-renewable resources, so that's ecosystems, but also non-living resources like minerals that combine to yield this flow of benefits to people, and that's what we call ecosystem services. And those benefits have a variety of different values to people and to business. So around the same time the Natural Capital Project was founded, back in 2005, there was a global assessment involving over 1,000 scientists of the state and trends of the world's ecosystem services, and it found that 2/3 of them are being degraded or used unsustainably. And so this was really a call to action to policymakers that this degradation is causing significant harm to these social and economic objectives. And then since 2005, in that kind of global level assessment, there's really been this fantastic collaboration that Katherine and I have been part of, but involving many, many different people around the world to work on these shared outcomes in specific places, in specific decisions. So not just a global call to action, but let's use this kind of science and information to improve decision making, whether it be development planning or spatial planning, or setting up new systems for supplying and incentivizing the provision of fresh water from forests. So there are many, many case studies we could choose from, but there are not many, as you can see from this map, unfortunately, yet in the Arctic, although we hope to change that. So I'm now going to hand over to Katherine to give a specific example from the Bahamas. But before I do, I just wanted to highlight what we see as core to any of these applications, and that is that at the very center, at the very core, there may be these technical assessments, these scientific assessments, which Katherine will show the results of, but also there will be these, and they go beyond human impacts on nature and dollar values of nature. They really map and measure the many different causes and consequences of the choices we make, and it's not science in a bubble. It's really a iterative, connected process involving researchers and communities and decision makers to define what they want to achieve, and then to use the science to help them achieve those objectives. So co-development's really at the heart of everything we do in this field. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Katherine. I will mute myself and just click through, Katherine, when you need me to.
Great, thanks so much, Emily. So the Bahamas is a place that has a wealth of natural resources. And this is one of the many reasons that a natural capital approach made sense in this place. So just to give you a little bit of the context, the Bahamas is going through a national development planning process in which they wanted to design and determine what their future would look like by 2040. And they wanted to do this because they were finding that they were getting a lot of development proposals from foreign entities, and they weren't quite sure if those development proposals fit with the vision that Bahamians wanted for their future. And they also knew that they had a number of different ministries and sectors within the government that weren't quite talking. So they wanted a national development plan that could knit together the efforts between fisheries management and forestry and agriculture and fresh water and development, among other ministries as well. And they started this national development planning with Andros, which is a relatively, well, it's a large island in the Bahamas, but it has a pretty small population and limited infrastructure. And yet this place is filled with natural resources. And the people on Andros have a desire to grow their economy and to make the best of the natural resources that they have. And because of the wealth of natural resources, they knew, the central government and people on Andros knew that a natural capital approach would be the most effective. So there's a number of issues on Andros that relate to this concept of natural capital that Emily introduced. So they're faced with issues of food security, of securing fresh water. There are issues interested in protection from storms and erosion. Of course, there's a multitude of cultural aspects that are important that relate to the land. They have a thriving ecotourism-based economy in which people come from all over the world to fish bonefish, which are unique to this area and dependent on a particular habitat. And all of these things are related to some of the SDGs that Emily brought up earlier. In addition, the government identified 4 pillars that they wanted to measure success by. And this is success for the national development planning process and the plan for Andros. And these were the economy, governance, environment, so both built and natural, and human capital. And in particular, the central government talks a lot about how environment and human capital underpin the economy and the governments of the Bahamas. So it goes back to that image that Emily showed of the concentric circles. And yeah, thanks, Emily. So stakeholders were really the driving force behind this development planning process on Andros. And what do I mean by stakeholders? Stakeholders were everything from development entities who wanted to, who had put forth particular proposals for development. It was all of the sectors that operate within the government, so agriculture, forestry, fisheries, et cetera. But at the core of this effort was stakeholders on the ground, so community members on Andros who wanted a voice in what the future would look like. And these were also the people who would be affected by the development decisions made by the government. So this is a process that NatCap helped to facilitate in the Bahamas and on Andros. And we went to stakeholders throughout the island and we said, what do you want your future to look like? And what are the things that you care about? And we heard people who said, we want really intensive development. We want a cruise ship. And we also heard people say, no, we don't want any of that. We just want to protect everything. And we coalesced these alternative visions for the future into different scenarios. And these scenarios were a conservation-based scenario, a sustainable prosperity scenario that knit together issues of conservation and of development, and then an intensive development scenario. And this scenario approach allowed us to both address and incorporate the different visions of the future, but also to include some of the natural drivers like climate change and how that might play out over the 25-year time horizon. We also looked to stakeholders to define what was important. How should we measure success? And this relates to those SDGs, right? And so what we heard from people on Andros was that there were 6 criteria that they wanted to focus on, that they wanted to measure success by. And that was recreation and tourism, so the bone fishing economy that I mentioned, in which people come and the bonefish depend on these estuaries and flats around the island. People were interested in protection from storms and erosion. Hurricanes come through the Bahamas, and people wanted to make sure that the habitats that they depend on to protect them from storms were protected, so that in the future they wouldn't be more vulnerable to storms. They also wanted to provide or increase their agricultural production in order to improve food security on the island. There's a thriving lobster fishery. It's one of the largest economies there, and people wanted to make sure that the lobster fishery would continue into the future. And they knew that the lobster fishery would be dependent on a lot of the habitats that support lobster. They wanted to secure fresh water, so it's an island, and they wanted to make sure that that vital resource was protected coming into the future. And then they also wanted to be able to continue to harvest land crabs, which are a locally traded and sold commodity that often support people in putting their kids through college. So the stakeholders both defined the visions for the future, but also the metrics of success. And it's these metrics of success or indicators of success that connected to the SDGs. So to measure each of these criteria, the Natural Capital Project used a lot of new and existing science. And we have a suite of models that fit under a toolbox that we call INVEST. And in the case of the Bahamas, we used a lot of existing science and existing models, and then we also tweaked some models and then also developed some new science. So we wanted to understand how the different visions for the future might affect the habitats, and these habitats are what support those services. So we have what we call a habitat risk assessment model that assesses the cumulative effects of human activities to a suite of different habitats. So we parameterized that model to be specific to Andros, but the science underlying it had already been developed. Similarly, we have a coastal vulnerability model that assesses how vulnerable the shoreline is to storms and erosion, and we used local parameter and local data, so geomorphology, for example, or wave exposure, but ultimately that was science that already existed. We also wanted to map and tweak things like we have a recreation and tourism model that some of the science had been developed, but we really expanded it in the Bahamas in order to incorporate issues of access and connectivity that's particularly important there. And then finally, in this particular application, we also created a lot of new science. So we heard that the lobster fishery was really important. So our fisheries ecologists, our fisheries scientists, came up with a production function that could help measure the output of lobster relative to nursery habitat and catch rates. And then she validated that model with local data from the Department of Marine Resources. Next slide. And so when we say science, what we really just mean is a model that helps us predict the outcomes based on a suite of inputs. So if we make a development decision now, what do we expect the future to look like? And so it's these suite of models, of tools that help us transform the visions of what people want for the future, and then help to understand the ways in which benefits from nature might change under those alternative scenarios. Next slide. So for each of the different criteria that community members identified, right, there's those eco-based tourism, protection from storms and erosion, food security, lobster, etc. We created maps, and then we used a single indicator in some cases to measure the output of those services. So here we're looking at the map on the left is the risk to mangrove, seagrass, and coral. The map second from the left is the export value of lobster, and these are all under the current scenario. So what are these services like now? The amount of shoreline that are at risk, and then the visitor expenditure. So this is just a sort of a sampling of how these tools can help create some visuals. We took these visuals back to communities in order to get feedback. And people were really interested to see them because it helped sort of make tangible this concept that they had been dealing with. They knew that their lobster fishery depended on natural habitats, but this helped them articulate that and really ground that. Next slide. In a lot of cases, we wanted to make sure that the indicators and of these services really resonated with people on the ground. So for the example of coastal vulnerability, we expressed this both as the coastal hazard, but also what's the role of habitats in providing protection from storms and erosion. And what's not shown here is we also took this metric even further to say, okay, under the different scenarios and the ways in which coastal vulnerability might shift, how does the number of people affected change? So are there going to be more people who are at risk from storms, or are there going to be less? And what's the amount of annual income that might be at risk or protected under different scenarios? Next slide. So again, this final slide that I'll show you is sort of a sampling of one of our synthesis figures. And so what you see from the top to the bottom are a number of the different services. So lobster, tourism, coastal protection, and habitat, functional habitat. And then moving from left to right, we have the different scenarios that I mentioned, the current situation, and then the three scenarios that stakeholders identified. And I think what's notable about this synthesis is the way in which each of these different services were represented in a number of different ways. So the lobster fishery, for example, had the pounds of catch, but it also had the export value. And if we had had more data, we would have really loved to say how many jobs are supported in this service. We were able to do something like that for tourism. So we measured the amount of visitor nights and the amount of money that those visitors spend, and then also the number of jobs, staff, and guides supported by that industry. So we could look at how those different components might change under the different scenarios. And as I mentioned, for coastal protection, we looked at the absolute amount of shoreline protected, but then also the amount of people protected and the amount of income protected. And based on all of that different information, we went back to the communities and ultimately people, after asking a lot of questions and we reran a lot of different things, ultimately the communities on Andros and the government and the different sectors agreed that the sustainable prosperity vision was what they wanted for their future. And so these models helped to create what is now the Andros Master Plan. So it's a blueprint for what development on Andros will look like. And it helps both sectors and incoming development proposals to have a sort of guiding framework to move forward with. And with that, I will stop. Thanks, Emily.
Yes, thanks, Katherine. So by my reckoning, we started at 10 past, so we've just got 5 more minutes now just to tie things up in terms of application in the Arctic. So we just want to lay the foundation for that in how we're presenting it to you and have some discussion with you about how this might translate to the Arctic region. So what we see in the Arctic region is unprecedented change, a very dynamic region with rapid climate change and potentially rapid development coming in the future, and that these multiple drivers could potentially have positive impacts for sustainable development, but also could have negative ones. And in the discussions we've been having in the past year with local leaders and communities and sectors, there is demand for information that includes traditional knowledge and the kind of empirical data and modeling in a kind of integrated framework. And I'm sure Katherine and I can take questions about how that integration happens if that's of interest, and that they want to do that to reduce risks to investments if they're investors, to avoid conflicts and build trust from government, to have kind of a transparency and have a voice in discussions if they're communities, to build resilience in the Arctic. And that we see the opportunity to use these kinds of tools and assessments to provide this kind of understanding of climate change and the impacts on ecosystem services of climate and development in this way that Katherine laid out. And so briefly, what's been done so far, some years ago, in 2015, I think, CAF, the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna Working Group of the Arctic Council, produced with many partners this report called TEEB, which stands for the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. It's a global effort, the TEEB effort, but they did a scoping study in the Arctic. And the objective was to show how to implement some of the recommendations that came out of the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment, which related to integrating biodiversity and ecosystem services into decision making, and they came out with some useful high-level sort of recommendations and findings about how to do these approaches in the Arctic. First of all, that it's important around communications that we don't equate value with price. We're not talking here about commodification or monetizing these benefits, but just recognizing their values in decision making. Being explicit that this represents different views, so the kind of broad stakeholder engagement that Katherine described from the Bahamas is vital, and that we're inclusive of different types of knowledge systems and different values, and take this holistic approach, and specifically operating at the level of kind of not just individual ecosystem services, but ecosystem service bundles of benefits that come together, which fits more with the worldviews of many indigenous communities in the region. And so following that scoping study, which WWF and many other partners were involved in, we've since, with our colleagues at the University of Washington and Stanford University, undertaken an inventory of what data and models and existing science initiatives are there in the Arctic, which produce the kind of data and science we would need to take this approach to the Arctic. So happy to share that catalog with you. And I should have referenced, sorry, when Katherine finished, that if you want more case studies, the Ruckelshaus paper and the one which has a lot of different numbers on it, which is by Angeri and others, are two handouts there that have a lot of other different case studies to explore. But back to this inventory, I'm happy to share that catalogue with you. We haven't done it as a handout, but it basically, what you're seeing here, these bars show the gap analysis that we did with the machine readable data to show the number of data sets from each large marine ecosystem, and displaying this map shows the bounding box of the gapping of the different data sets in the gap analysis. So dark orange means a higher density of data. So that's given us an understanding that there is a large quantity and variety of relevant data, but it is somewhat patchy by in the region. But we think the data is good enough to be able, in fact, better than in many of the regions we've tried to do this, particularly in the North American Arctic. There are many related great initiatives. We've been particularly exploring those in Alaska that we can build off. Includes things like the North Slope Bureau of Land Management's rapid ecoregional assessments, which has a lot of related data, the Alaska Ocean Observing System, which has a lot of related data. But there's no one initiative that's directly focusing on and has the capacity to do this kind of ecosystem service assessment, although together, if we can bring broader collaboration, we think we can. And the other piece of work we've done, which is quite fun, I wish we were all together in the same room to do it with you, is the development of this board game, which is called Arctic Choices. The board game and all the materials you would need to play it are freely available online. If you're interested, I can share the link. And it was designed, it's a participatory game, takes about an hour to play in teams to illustrate how this approach works in practice. And we found it to be a really effective way of engaging people, to have this sort of aha moment about how this stuff really works. And this game is tailored for the Arctic. So through these sort of grounding pieces, the TEEB scoping study, then the technical inventory and this gameplay and the outreach we've been doing over the past year at various Arctic gatherings, we're building to what we hope will be this future work, focusing on development planning and infrastructure in particular, that and because we're focusing on infrastructure, we'll be establishing and drawing on global standards for sustainable infrastructure, and then developing the kind of decision support tools that Katherine laid out in the Bahamas, but focused on informing infrastructure development in the Arctic and enabling many to take this approach and replicate it. And very, very briefly, because we're out of time, we want to leave enough for discussion. I briefly wanted to mention the Shore standard. This is not the only infrastructure standard out there, but we're scoping this standard very carefully. It's going to be launched at the COP23 in Bonn in November. It's a standard for sustainable and resilient infrastructure. And within that, they have specific performance criteria and indicators for what sustainable infrastructure looks like. And so what we're thinking could be a useful way to go forward with this work is to consult and adapt either the shore standard or multiple standards, global standards that exist to the Arctic region, which will provide this set of indicators through that dialogue and through that consultation, these indicators like Katherine laid out for the Bahamas, that then we can use these science and tools to measure against. So I think I'm going to finish there and skip over the last couple of slides to make sure we have enough time for discussion, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, Katherine, for the great presentation and interesting overview. I think it's an up-and-coming topic, and unfortunately, I missed last year at the Arctic Circle Assembly. I think it was the first launch of the game, actually, of the tabletop exercise, due to other commitments. But I was definitely looking forward, and I hope maybe if you are there this year again, you will share that game with us again, and maybe some of our participants will be able to join us there.
Thanks. Yeah, we do intend to go to the Arctic Circle again and have a session on these sets of topics. We weren't planning to play the game, but we can always bring it and have it down in the foyer and just do it unofficially. Hopefully it's fun enough.
I would love that. I've heard only good things about it. So thank you again. And maybe just towards our attendees, I've uploaded 4 handouts that Emily and Katherine provided me with. So maybe Emily, if you can say a little bit about it as well. You all find it in the handout slider on the side of the program, below the questions in my case, and then you'll see 4 PDFs that Emily sent to me. So maybe Emily could.
Yeah, sure. I mentioned 3 of them, but maybe it was lost in the mix. I'll go over them carefully now. So the Global Arctic Program fact sheet just outlines WWF's work in the Arctic, much more broadly than what we've covered, but for those of you who are interested in what WWF does. The 2 peer-reviewed articles are the Rockleshouse article from Ecological Economics, and then the one which says 150375, very unexcitingly, which is Anne Gary led paper in Proceedings of National Academy in Sciences. And both those papers lay out multiple case studies globally of how this approach is working and where the frontiers are for the promise of this approach, what it's going to take to scale it. So just in terms of brainstorming how this might apply and the potential and challenges of applying it in the Arctic, those could be interesting for you. And then finally, the one I didn't mention was the IDEAS fact sheet. So IDEAS has been the acronym we're using for this project that we're getting off the ground to apply this approach in the Arctic. It stands for Informing Decisions for Ecological and Arctic, Ecological and Economic Arctic Sustainability, which is why it's better to just say IDEAS. And that's just a 2-page fact sheet about the project, which we actually did for the Arctic Circle. So it's a little out of date. We'll probably do an updated one when we get moving with this next phase on the ground. But it just describes at a high level our vision for what we're hoping we could achieve in the Arctic region.
Great, thank you so much. I already received a couple of questions, and I'll unmute Ben first. I think he was referring to 2 of the papers. Apparently they are not available to him, but maybe that's changed. But also maybe, Ben, you want to ask a little follow-up about the content of the papers and the work of Emily and Katherine. So you are unmuted now. Ben, can you hear us? Hello? Maybe now?
Hello?
Hello, something? Ben, go ahead. Yes, perfectly. Go ahead.
Sorry, my sound was cut. No, I was very interested on the inventory of models and data related to the capability to make natural capital modeling and assessment that you were referring to. I wanted to know if it was possible to have this this set of criteria and models. Especially, I was very surprised that you were saying that in some of the region, the amount of data was more than decent to realize this kind of studies. Are they usually very, very data intensive? And I know the second point was just very quickly that one of the papers, I don't manage to reach one of the documents on the Ruckle House paper. So if you could elaborate a bit what the content of it is.
Sorry, let me just unmute. And I think Katherine should definitely respond on the data one. But yep, we'll be happy to share the data and model inventory. It was led by my colleague Spencer Wood. So after this webinar, we'll just get back in touch with him and check how he's happy to share it. But the intention of doing that inventory, and just to be clear, it's not a database in itself. It's a catalog, really a list of the data and models and initiatives that their team identified would contribute to these kinds of assessments. So following this, maybe Anna, I can introduce you to Spencer, and then you can decide how best to share it with all the participants here. It includes a report, a sort of 20-page report, which does this gap analysis and summarizes the key findings. And then there's just an online Google Doc, which has the inventory itself and links to all the data sets. So we'll do that as a next step. The Ruckles House paper is an assessment of, I can't remember now exactly how many because it's from a few years ago, but I think at least 20, maybe more, of the first case studies that, or demonstration sites we called them, places in the world where we took this approach, and showing the different ways in which this kind of information informs decision making. And again, I'm a co-author on both these papers, so happy to share them directly if they're not available to you. I'm not sure that, I think PNAS and ecological economics are open. But anyway, I'm very happy to just share PDFs, and Anna can forward them to you and anyone else interested if you can't get them from this link. And then Katherine, maybe you can talk about the data issue, about dates, how intensive the data requirements are.
That's a great question about data use and how intensive the data need to be. So one of the things that the InVEST modeling software tries to do is to strike this balance between capturing the reality and the conditions on the ground, but also being usable across the globe. So a lot of our models do require data, and I should mention that these models are open source, so anyone can download them and use them. They do require data, but a lot of this data is freely available. So habitat data, for example, there are a lot of global habitat data sets, and then you can modify them if you have local data available. Or if you're going to evaluate coastal vulnerability, for example, there's a number of parameters and sort of rules that dictate how vulnerable a shoreline is. And so you modify them in a particular location, but ultimately some of the core data sets are pretty freely available.
And I would just add that you know, the data quality does matter for the results. Obviously, it's hugely important. You crap in, you crap out. But that what we've seen in this assessment is that in some regions of the Arctic, there's some really excellent detailed data that would be fantastic base for doing this. We have worked in places with incredibly limited data, you know, including in Central Africa. So our bar is, you know, goes quite low as well.
Great, wonderful. Thank you both, and of course, get us in touch, and we'll find a way to forward anything you send us to our interested participants.
I just wanted to add to that that this inventory is not like a static finished document by any means. We see this as like a living way of tracking and engaging with partners. So if you're aware of something we've missed or we've incorrectly represented, it's kind of an ongoing review process. So we'd really welcome any corrections or comments or suggestions on that that technical inventory, as well as, you know, people who are interested to get engaged with us going forward on this work.
Great, thank you so much. All right, I do have two more questions from our attendees right now, so ask away. I think we will have time for one or two more before we go to the second topic today. We have Brittany next, and I'm afraid I think you don't have audio because I cannot unmute you. So, but I read your question for you. So Brittany's question is, what role do you see for the Arctic Council in adopting and promoting global standards for sustainable and resilient infrastructure? Do you think that the likelihood of incorporating ecosystem services in decision-making should be driven top-down from a centralized body like the Arctic Council, or bottom-up from individual communities?
Great questions. I wish your audio was on so you could tell me what you think as well. But so on the first question, what role do we see for the Arctic Council? And you, Brittany, your question was on adopting global standards for infrastructure, which I've thought about less well than I thought about this question, so I'm just going to rephrase it and then come back to the question you asked. What role do we see for the Arctic Council in promoting and enabling the adoption of these kinds of approaches to decision making broadly, you know, whether it be to meet global standards of infrastructure or for their own development planning? And I guess we see that as a central role. We think the role of governments is critical in enabling these approaches to go to the heart of development planning and policy across entire countries and regions, and the Arctic Council is obviously the critical body for that. And so, and we see the Sustainable Development Working Group as being an existing body where we would like to do a similar process actually to this and present when we are a little further ahead with details on phase 2 to lay those out, and we're hoping that there will be some champions within the Arctic Council members. On adopting global standards for infrastructure, I'd have to think about that a little more, but I would assume that the Arctic Council could be a critically influential body in doing that. We are doing a review, we've actually hired AECOM to do a review of global infrastructure standards and global safeguards, which aren't just about infrastructure, but things like the IFC performance standards and World Bank standards and so on, from which we hope will be some interesting findings about the gaps and strengths of them. And then again, that could be a process of engagement for dialogue with the Arctic Council. But I'd love to hear what others think on that question. It's a really good one. And then, do I think that these approaches should be top-down or bottom-up? I think in a typical fudge, I think they have to be both. But it seems to me to be absolutely vital that you have both. Without one or the other, you miss out. So if you're just doing community engagement, you miss the opportunity to do scaling across whole countries, and we've done plenty of work which have just been small pilots that then don't have the enabling policy and the replication to take it to scale. Similarly, if you're just working top-down from governments or Arctic Council level, you're not getting the absolutely vital, as Katherine laid out in the Bahamas example, input and dialogue with people on the ground about what they care about, what are the specifics, because you can talk in generalities but about sustainable development goals, but when you get to a real place, people have very specific things that they're looking for, how they define sustainable development. So you have to have that dialogue and co-development. So I would say it's essential to have both.
Great, wonderful, thank you so much. And then we have 2 more questions. One is from Lisa, and I hope Lisa has a microphone available. So you are unmuted, Lisa. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. However, I don't know, it seems to me that this localization, regionalization, I don't really know how to define it, but the fact that the data comes mainly from a specific side of the Arctic as a region, don't you think will in a certain way influence the final outcome, and at the same time sort of a global outcome? What I mean is that we know that the ecosystem of the Arctic ecosystem is fundamental for the biosphere and the equilibrium of the biosphere, therefore modifying and the condition of the ecosystem in the Arctic will modify the condition of the ecosystem in the temperate zone. The fact that the data are so regionalized, how can impact the research?
I don't know if you want to talk about the data element of this, Katherine. I think you should, but obviously the Arctic is can't say entirely unique. I guess the Amazon also has this element to it, in that, but that what happens there, as you're saying, has huge impacts for the rest of the globe, particularly around climate change, but not limited. You know, the impacts on global fisheries, global climate, and so on. And so that's going to be something we have to be really thoughtful about and careful about when we start to move into actual pilot regional assessments. Because in any assessment we do, we're looking at bundles of ecosystem services. We have to look at who benefits, who are the beneficiaries. And we use another piece of jargon called service sheds, so anyone living within those service sheds benefits. And so I think your question was getting at that, and in which case, when there are global benefits from the change that's happening from a specific region within the Arctic or circumpolar Arctic, we will want to be making clear what the impacts are for the rest of the globe. And there we can still do analyses. It means that you're not only limited to only looking at data within a specific said region. You can expand those service sheds, those regions, depending on specific ecosystem services and how people interact with them. So something that happens in Alaska may affect people far, far away in terms of fisheries that they go eat on a table over in, I don't know, here in London or something. So we need to clearly define who they are and use the appropriate scale of data for those questions. But Katherine, maybe if you have anything to add, please do, or if I misconstrued anything.
I think it's a great question, and I think it's something that we're still struggling with. As Emily said, sort of local decisions can have, or as you said, sorry, local decisions and local development can have global impacts. And I think that in some ways, the data and the specific decision context allow us to present those in different ways. And what I mean by that is, I think carbon storage is a really good example of that, or climate change. And so you can express what does climate change mean for a local community in terms of rising sea level or infrastructure falling apart, and then you can also express that what does climate change mean for the global community. And then in terms of the data, and I think if I understood your question correctly, you're thinking about the sort of the spatial location of where those data are available. And this is a really big project, as I'm sure you've gathered. And so I think one of the things I had at least envisioned, is starting in specific locations. So starting where there are data, and then scaling that to larger areas and to other areas. And ultimately, as we move through time and progress with these applications, hopefully additional data come online, and we're able to replicate it across the entirety of the Arctic.
All right. Lisa, do you feel your question sufficiently answered? I know it's a tough one.
Yeah, of course, and I completely agree. It still makes, I don't know, it's huge to think, right? So it's a huge project, and it's huge to see the project as a whole, because it's so big. So it's a good answer, and I completely agree. I mean, it's necessary to focus on what you have before going too broad.
Right. All right, I agree. Thank you so much, Lisa, again. And then I'll hand over the next question. And as of now, the last one on this topic, to Ben once more. And I'll unmute you. There we go, Ben. Go ahead.
Hello again. My question is related on the role that you give to the private sector, especially if you focus on infrastructure development. In most of region, it's still an activity where the planning is usually left to the hand of the project developer. How do you coordinate with them? Do you apply global standards? Do they come only after all the environmental impact assessment study have been made by third parties? How does it work in the Arctic right now? And also, how do you envision it to happen in the best case scenario in the future?
Yeah, that's an absolutely brilliant question, and we're wrestling with this very much in terms of thinking about who we are building tools for and how that kind of chain of private and public sector actors works in the infrastructure sector. So, and if people around the school have expertise, we'd really welcome your input. At the moment, we believe that the WWF, is and our partners, are still small actors, but we have, as I think Lisa was getting at, big ambitions. And so we're constantly thinking about how can we have the most influence and impact with the small resources we have for the better of the planet and the people who live on it, the creatures that live on it. And so in order to do that, I think we need to get what we're sure about, we believe, is that we have to get what we call upstream. So early on in the infrastructure development process is where the biggest decisions are made. So once you get far down the mitigation hierarchy of the planning process, once you get to the process of doing an EIA, for example, and I'm not sure if this applies in many regions of the Arctic, thinking about sort of mitigation and offsetting, you're really changing something very marginal about the project. You're not thinking about whether the project should be there in the first place or whether it should be in a completely different location. Often it's really small changes. And so then we're trying to define what does it mean to get furthest upstream. And the most obvious example of the most upstream is government, usually government planning, development planning, which it varies by country, but this is planning at often national scale and regional scales, nested scales, to define what you want. And that really sort of, Katherine's example was a great one of that. So that's kind of the dream outcome in some ways, but with a big caveat that once you've got that dream plan, it needs to be financed and made real and implemented. So that's where we see the private sector being key, in particular financial institutions, institutional investors who share a long-term view about wanting to minimize environmental and social risks from infrastructure. And then what we're exploring is what is the relationship of investors with project developers and the government to get far upstream so that they can use these kinds of information systems to take a big scale, sort of saying, looking at multiple potential infrastructure projects under future scenarios of climate change, looking at cumulative impacts and being really smart at large scales about where to allow what to happen. Rather than what has been the case in the Arctic and actually in most of the globe, which is project by project planning, following safeguards really far down the line, and where you've only got limited ability to change. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think is a really important one. That we see the role of the private sector being key, and we're exploring which actors in the private sector are engaged at the earliest stages and what's their relationship, how do they connect also within the planning cycle to provide a motivation for better planning. And I think final point is that global standards, we think, are going to be an absolutely essential element for all of that to scale it. You can't just have a tool in the absence of a set of standards that are replicable. Yeah, I'll stop there. It was a very good question. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the answer as well. And thank you, Ben, for asking it. It is, I think, indeed a question that came up last week as well. The involvement of the private sector has been a challenge, I think, throughout, especially environmental and sustainable development in different settings, and the Arctic doesn't seem to be an exception to the rule. All right, I think that's, as of now, the questions that I have on my list. So unless one of you quickly types here in the chat box or the question box, then I would suggest to turn over to our second presentation today. So you will have your 10 seconds of thinking. Otherwise, no, fret not. There will be the chance to ask more questions after the second presentation. And of course, you can refer back to issues that came to your mind during the second presentation. So thank you again, Katherine and Emily. And Emily will stick around with us for a little while more, and so feel free to continue with your questions in the chat box. All right, I will make now a Nils, the presenter. Nils, be prepared. and you will be hopefully able to share your screen now as well. Welcome, Nils. I'll give a brief introduction. Nils Andreassen is the Executive Director of the Institute of the North. His degree in Peace and Development from the Uni of Bradford in England, and his background in rural and international development, Alaska and Arctic policy fits well into the Institute's work and mission. The Institute's mission is to inform public policy as it relates to natural resource development, and specifically to result in improved living and economic conditions for northern residents. So Nils, welcome. We're glad to have you on board. And we can see your screen already. So if you start your presentation straight away, I think we can start.
Great, thank you. And my apologies that the webcam isn't working, but you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. There's a little bit of an echo, but I think once I mute myself, it might be a little better. And yeah, so if you start your presentation, that should be perfect.
Yeah, well, thank you. So just a little bit about the Institute of the North. We're a 20-year-old nonprofit based here in Alaska, but with a circumpolar reach to really look at Alaska's Arctic policy and help provide strategic recommendations for how to address many of the challenges and opportunities that the state faces, to think about the state's position globally, and to offer advice and learn about resource governance, infrastructure development, and I would say generally sustainability. So I think what I'll do today is maybe just introduce you to Alaska and how we think of the Arctic in this state. We've just last year produced an Alaska's Arctic book, so I'll run through as slides that book. And in it, we've broken the state into 4 different Arctic regions. And
just quickly, sorry if I interrupt, Nils. If you go for full screen or presentation mode, then we can see everything of your presentation. So far, it's just it shows the window within your desktop.
Oh, I'm looking at it.
But if you go from beginning, it should open it, and then we should be able to see it. It usually takes a second to show on the big screen and to upload the image.
Yeah, I'm on sorry, 2 screens.
Right.
Let me do this. That doesn't help any now.
Or maybe if you pick the specific PowerPoint window from the drop-down menu, then you can also select to share just that window, and then it should be also visible full screen already while it's not on your desktop. There we go. That's looking better.
We'll just do this. Sorry.
That works, no worries.
Yeah. Anyway, so high Arctic for Alaska is roughly the size of 2.5 Icelands. It's an area north of the Brooks Range that is lightly populated but heavily resourced in terms of oil and gas resources. Very dependent on marine mammal, especially whaling in the region, and access to caribou. So there's a very direct connection here between resource development and traditional subsistence practices. But from a socioeconomic perspective, it really is defined by oil and gas development. And we kind of do a regional analysis that highlights what that looks like. So from gas development that's not actually occurring right now, but will be soon. Actually, a tenth of the $1 trillion investment figure that Emily gave earlier is probably attributed to the natural gas resource on Alaska's North Slope. So when you think of a $100 billion project, they add up pretty quickly across the Arctic, and Alaska's is prominent in that. Prudhoe Bay is the nation's largest oil field and continues to expand in bits and pieces. All the oil and gas development in Alaska, coming from Alaska's North Slope, is basically what pays for state government. Just a few years ago, it was 80 or 90% of the state operating budget that was coming directly from basically Prudhoe Bay. That's changed somewhat with the prices, but still is fairly significant. It's also what pays for all the local government and private sector employment on the North Slope. The second region that I would reference would be the Arctic, which is roughly the size of California and located just below the North Slope. And here we really see a region defined by mining and along the coast by Bering Strait activity. So there's, when we talk about mining in Alaska or mining in Alaska's Arctic, there's only one operating mine in the entire region, and it's the Red Dog mine that funds all the, again, private sector employment, local government, and everything in the region.
Right, we see there's a quick need to dial down, but I think Nils will continue in a second. All right, that's a little unfortunate. Nils, can you still hear us? I can still see your mouse.
Are you? I think I'm back.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that.
I hope no case of emergency.
No, just technical difficulties.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks.
Sorry, so yeah, the Arctic region defined by mining, and that's again what pays for employment, local government, and other services in the region. Marine mammal hunting, especially important, as well as caribou harvest and gathering. A third part of the state, the low Arctic, roughly the size of all the Nordic states put together, if you include the maritime area, not defined by oil and gas, not defined by mining at all, entirely defined by fisheries and an active shipping route. Shipping through Unimak Pass between North America and Asia there's more that takes place annually than the rest of the Arctic combined. So it's very much a region that's defined by again, it's maritime activity. We kind of run through that in the regional analysis, and I think you'll find that for each of these regions, the fact that they're defined by on the one hand oil and gas, the other mining, and the other maritime activity, they've set up systems in each region that support those activities, manage risk relative to those activities, and benefit from those activities. And they're very specific within those regions where economic activity is occurring. That's where you see a different level of services and risk management. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The rest of the state, the near Arctic, the size of 4 U.S. states, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, really provides all the connective tissue to support economic activity and social services in the rest of the state. So in Fairbanks, you'll find our research capital, which produces more Arctic-sited research than any other university in the world. In Anchorage, you have all the economic, all the offices of all the companies that are operating in the Arctic region, and all those support services that are placed in Anchorage as well. And then in Juneau, that's where state government's located, and so that's our political center. And you'll find that I think of Alaska as, if those are the 4 Arctic regions, if you think of haves and have-nots, 2 of those Arctic regions have and 2 don't. And most of interior Alaska, which if I go back to near Arctic, is really the region between Anchorage and Fairbanks, and then north of Fairbanks before the Brooks Range. There's very little activity taking place, and you have a region that sees a lot of the risk from or negative effects of climate change. You see a region very dependent on subsistence activities, but with very little economic prospects. And it's one of the more challenged. Interior of Alaska is very challenged relative to much of the rest of the state. So those are the 4 Arctic regions within Alaska. From a socio-political or political-economic perspective, the state of Alaska is one of the few, well, it's the only state that has an Arctic policy, and really has one of the most developed subnational policies out there. 4 policy statements to uphold the state's commitment to economically vibrant communities sustained by development activities consistent with the state's responsibility for a healthy environment, to collaborate with all levels of government and stakeholders, to enhance the security of the state through a safe and secure Arctic, and to value and strengthen the resilience of communities. And I would actually offer that within this policy, you'll find a downscaled version of the Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of alignment between the 2, but with very much an Alaska and Arctic context, including an indigenous context that I would say is lacking in the Sustainable Development Goals. The state at the same time has developed an implementation plan, 60% of which has been addressed in some form in the 2 years that the state produced this. And we'll continue to see a number of these recommendations addressed in the years to come. A lot of it's been constrained by a lack of resources at the state level during a very significant economic downturn faced by the state, mostly related to oil prices. Of course, there is a federal governance involved. The national strategy for the Arctic region is defined how the U.S. has approached the Arctic over the last 4 or so years. Very little about economic development in this, in the national strategy or the implementation plan. You'll find it embedded within an approach to stewardship or a line of effort of stewardship. But there's nobody really within U.S. federal government, there's nobody in charge of, there's no agency in charge of sustainable economic development. 20 different agencies that are involved in decision-making in the Arctic, and no real plan for infrastructure or economic development, and nothing strategic necessarily related to those. So there's real disconnect, I would say, between a federal approach and an Alaskan approach, and a lot of work to be done in connecting the 2, strengthening the cooperation between the 2, and coming up with a more strategic and intentional approach to sustainable development in the region. And this is very different than you'll find in, I would say, any other Arctic nation, where regional development has a home at a national level, and very direct investments from an Arctic state into an Arctic region. So I think that's kind of a systemic issue that will need to be addressed in the years to come. Alaska, 229 tribes within the state, very different than how it's been organized in the rest of the U.S. I think what's important here in an Arctic context is that each of the tribes in Alaska have sovereignty, but they don't have land ownership. So there's a duty to consult. The federal government has to consult with tribes, and the state of Alaska often does. But there's nothing requiring a project proponent to consult with tribes because the tribes aren't landowners. So if you think of the Arctic in terms of risk and benefit, it's tribes that don't see necessarily any of the benefit and who probably often feel most of the risk. There are a number of authorities or responsibilities that tribes do have, and I think one of the highlights has been the tribal health system. A lot of that funded through federal and other dollars. Alaska Native corporations, however, are the landowners. So an act more than 20 years ago now, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, split tribal sovereignty and land ownership up, and within that formed 12 Alaska Native corporations who are the ones who are making resource decisions, land and resource decisions in the region. Federal government doesn't have any duty to consult with Alaska Native corporations, but these are the economic powerhouses in the region and are the ones often setting out the strategic plan for how a region might develop and how the corporation itself can develop in a way that benefits shareholders. Alaska Native corporations, I think, have often been conflated with tribes, and there's a lot of assumed responsibilities or expectations of corporations that they would act in the same way as a tribe, but they don't have a legal or strict responsibility to social or sort of cultural values. So I would argue they very much live by them. Finally, in terms of governance, Alaska is split up into a number of different local governments. All the cities have some form of local government, and then half the state has been formed into a county structure, or boroughs. And again, boroughs, and this probably tells the story of which regions have seen success and which haven't. Where there's a borough government, that in green, there's economic activity that funds it. And where there's a borough government, there's something like comprehensive planning related to transportation, public services, economic development taking place. And where there's not a borough government, that's lacking. So in terms of risk and benefit, the regions in green have benefited from resource activities in their region or other economic activity, and the regions in yellow haven't and really struggle. Beyond those levels of government in Alaska, there's a lot of informal networks and civil society that are active in the Arctic. Regional leadership, often involving indigenous peoples, covers much of the state. There's an Arctic Marine Mammal Coalition that helps coordinate Alaska Native indigenous subsistence activities. The Arctic Waterway Safety Committee was just established to help facilitate a better use of Arctic maritime areas. There's an Inuit Arctic Business Alliance. The Alaska Federation of Natives is the longest-standing group of Alaska Native indigenous interests. And then the Voice of the Arctic Inupiat is recently formed to represent Inupiat in the North Slope. And it's interesting because they just went through a strategic planning session and set out a vision for the future that is driven by and actually expands resource development. They don't see it as an either or. They see expanded resource development and continued subsistence activities as possible and valuable. Of course, there's 4 of the 6 permanent participants are represented in Alaska's Arctic, the Arctic Athabascan Council, Aleut International Association, Gwich'in Council International, and the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And I would say that these 4 kind of split out into that haves and have-nots that was described earlier. So the Arctic Athabascan Council and Gwich'in Council International are based within interior Alaska and don't have the same maritime or resource activities as do Aleut International Association and Inuit Circumpolar Council. It's really interesting to, in all, from an Arctic Council perspective, each of these are equal, but they're not equally resourced at all, and have very different perspectives because of that. Finally, there's a number of different research groups here who really deliver on Arctic expertise. And I would say that Alaska doesn't lack for expertise or competency. It's not a capability that Alaska lacks in the Arctic, from renewable energy to cold weather construction, maritime services to emergency response. There are any number of different examples of best practices that Alaska has either developed or driven. I think this is something that isn't well understood outside the Arctic or even within the rest of the U.S. Speaking with colleagues in Germany just recently, and their research institute couldn't think of any expertise in Alaska of renewable energy related issues, and there's a lot of communication I think that has to take place in terms of describing Alaska and really Arctic peoples as leaders and innovators, and less as at the center of risk, and that's something I think that can happen better within an Arctic Council context too. So here's just a quick snapshot of all the mineral, oil, and gas resources in the state. Again, you could take a quick look at this and get to that $1 trillion investment figure very quickly. But then, realizing that there's only one of these mines that's actually active in the Arctic, and only a few others besides that, which are active in Alaska. So a lot of resource potential, a lot of which isn't economic at all to develop. And I would say this is very similar to what's faced in most of northern Canada or even Greenland. A lot of resource potential that's very expensive, and not a main revenue driver for state or local government, or at least state government. The mining tax here is very minimal. Often Alaska is thought of, though, as a natural resource state, so from oil and gas to fisheries, timber to mining, and we include tourism in that natural resource. It's a resource-rich state, and I've heard the expression not only in Alaska but in Saha Republic in Russia. Our God is informing the world, tripped and showered the Arctic with natural resources. Those resources aren't just extractive. Of course, the state is one of the leaders, I would say, in renewable energy, and especially renewable energy resource potential. So from biomass to geothermal, hydropower, to tidal, solar, and wind, there's plenty of resource potential. Most of it's stranded, most of it's expensive to develop, and none of it delivers revenue to state or local government. There's a lot of it. There has been in the past investment from both state and federal governments into renewable energy development. A lot of utilities have seen a shift toward one renewable or another. And Alaska actually leads the world right now in a combination of wind diesel applications and utilities. Some of our communities are 90–95% renewable energy driven. And there's a real push for this, but there's, again, that often we hear the argument, why don't we switch from oil and gas to renewables? And it doesn't work that way when it comes to revenue generated for the state of Alaska. Key infrastructure in the state, a lot of it isolated and unconnected, pretty strong aviation network, and actually one of the strongest aviation networks in the world in terms of fixed plane landings across the state. More than 200 airports in each community. It's the only way to get in and out for most of the communities. And everything comes through Anchorage, whether it's aviation or maritime, to be distributed to the rest of the state. Of course, and I've talked a little bit about some of the oil and gas infrastructure. There's been a lack of telecommunications infrastructure, which just this year and in coming years should be addressed with a couple of different projects that private companies are building out. And I would say that, in a lot of ways, there's lots of infrastructure that we could have, but there's, I think more importantly, there's a prioritization of infrastructure related to community or project development that really hasn't happened because there's no coordinating body who's determining what those priorities should look like. So you've probably heard the term economies of scale. I think of it in Alaska as societies of scale, and economy is just a part of it. But the fact that so many of these communities are remote, are distant from markets, distant from goods, lack some of the basic and affordable things like energy, telecommunications, healthcare, water and sewer. There's really a society of scale issue in most of Arctic Alaska. And it's very different than urban Alaska, Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau. That feel at least a little bit connected, but most Arctic communities don't. And so that's really where the challenge lies. It's not in Alaskans' competence or capabilities. It's in the scale of the challenge. Whether it's water and sewer, telecommunications, energy and power, or even healthcare. And there was a report just recently how Alaska healthcare costs have gone up 200% in just the last few years. So the scale of the problem is really the challenge, not the competency or capability. And it's, I would say, aggravated by some of the basic living conditions that we see in much of Alaska. From suicide and depression to alcoholism to domestic violence. That's some very fundamental problems, health and mental health problems within Arctic communities that are, I think, part of a bigger picture. Some of the systemic issues that I've talked about earlier, but also in terms of system, the fact that there's people living in those communities with long and strong cultural traditions and faced with, in a lot of ways, lack of opportunity in moving forward. Very few jobs, very few economic or workforce opportunities. It's important to know, I think, that most of Alaska is publicly owned. Most of Alaska is conserved in one form or another. Only 1% of Alaska has private ownership, if you don't count Alaska Native corporations, which leaves 60 to 70% or more either in federal or state ownership. And almost all of both are in some form of park or refuge or forest that's protected by federal statute. Similarly, most of Alaska's waters are in some form of marine protected area or some version of a marine protected area. There's actually a lot of conservation that's going on in the state, and when we think about kind of the big picture of sustainability, much of Alaska is sustainably managed, and especially with a focus on some of the wild, the wilderness, and kind of unique areas of the state. So I often say, when it comes to the environment, that if you're interested in hearing more about how Alaskans are approaching the Arctic environment, it's easy just to ask Alaskans about the robust regulations and statutes that are in place, the decision making that occurs, that science and traditional knowledge inform, how everybody works together to make sure that they can continue to live off the land as they have for so long. Mostly you'll hear Alaskans talk about resource and economic development because they need both of those things to be able to pay for the essential service the state delivers. But that shouldn't be read as a lack of interest in environmental protection. And I'll just wrap up with one more element in terms of a sustainable approach to the Arctic and Alaska, and that's with safety and response. So a lot of the rhetoric, I would say, related to search and rescue or oil spill response or other emergency preparedness in the region is focused on areas where there's not actually human or economic activity. Most of the state is well covered in terms of safety and response, and where there's robust economic activity, either resource related or otherwise, there's a very strong emergency response in place, either through federal assets, state assets, oil spill response organizations that are funded by industry, or industry assets. And I think this is something that's always very surprising to see just how much is there in the state in terms of environmental emergency response and protection. And a lot of different organizations, a lot of it coordinated by state government, that help to ensure safety at sea and response preparedness. And the gap, I mean, two main gaps I would say is, as traffic increases in the Bering Strait, you'll see additional need for a response capacity there. And in the North Slope, the high Arctic region of the state, there's no federal presence necessarily, so all the search and rescue that should be done or is done by the U.S. Coast Guard and any other place in the U.S. is actually handled by the local government, which is paid for by oil and gas receipts. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Nils, for this exciting overview about Alaska. I've learned a lot already, and also for the great maps and graphics. It is a very picture-heavy presentation, but we'll try to make it available to our participants as well, so you can dive into the details of the graphics and figures as well. Yeah, thanks again. I already have a couple of questions myself, but of course I want to give our attendees first the chance to ask their questions. I was encouraging during the webinar, but of course now you're more than welcome to ask your questions straight away. If you just type in the question box that you have one, let me know, and then I'll direct straight to you.
On that one screen.
Say it again? Oh, there we go. Right, okay, so now it's even bigger, but well, that's fine, that should be all right. Right, I guess Lisa's question already referred to the size of the slides, but now I think it's gonna be fine if we share it with the participants. Let me just ask around into the round of our fellows. So if anyone else has a question, let me or us know. Otherwise, I'll just ask my question first. But there we go. Lisa has one. So just a second, Lisa. And the mic is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting, and also it was a different eye on the state of Alaska. That's why my first question was about, can you share with us your slides? Because even like that, they are very, very small, but they look extremely interesting, and it would be a pleasure. Second point, I really appreciated you mentioning the Alaska Native Corporations topic, because effectively it's extremely interesting and it's the first time I hear about that. I would like to understand what's the strong relationship between those native corporations and the Sustainable Development Objectives. And second point, does this structure look like the Arctic Council structure, in the sense that even in the Arctic Council there's an important representation of indigenous communities, but now they are people don't exactly know what will be their role if the Arctic Council turns to be an international or intergovernmental organization. What's the relationship in this case?
No, it's actually one of the conflict points I see in the coming years. So, I mean, within Alaska, you've got at least 3 different levels of organization of indigenous peoples, and really depending on the region more so. So you've got in most of Arctic Alaska, you have a tribe. You might have more than one in one community, and then you also have a local government, which is led by tribal members, but is a political unit of the state government. And then you actually have a village corporation, and then you have an Alaska Native regional corporation. So just within one community, you could have as many as 5 different coordinating or organizing bodies related to decision making in that community. In a broader context, the regional corporation will often will work closely with the local government or the regional government and tribes. Does consultation regularly in terms of what priorities should be, but is left out of any formal decision making within a federal federal consultation. And these are all the same people, right? So they could have a tribal hat on one time and an Alaska Native regional corporation hat on the other, or a local government hat on there. It's the same group of indigenous peoples, but representing very different perspectives to a large extent. So there's a lot of, I mean, in terms of the system of how indigenous peoples and organizations and companies and rights holders are brought together, there's a lot of opportunity for conflict within that. And if you kind of stretch that out to how the state and indigenous peoples within the state connect with national governments or ENGOs or the Arctic Council, lots of ways to represent Alaska Natives or indigenous peoples in very different ways at each of those levels. Within an Arctic Council context, permanent participants aren't elected. They're not tribes. They're not representing Alaska Native corporations. They're non-governmental organizations that are their own thing, really. So they really operate outside of the actual rights holder position of tribes or Alaska Native corporations. And I see actually a lot of domestic conflict for how those conversations take place about what PPs are saying within an Arctic Council context and how states respond to a permanent participant versus how a state should be consulting with and meaningfully involving the rights holders in the region.
Right, thank you very much. Thanks also, Lisa, for your question. I hope that's sort of answered for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, it's extremely interesting.
Right. Okay, great. And again, we'll try to share the presentation soon. I think maybe tomorrow we'll have to find a proper place to upload it and make it available to all of you, because it's, I think, over 40 megabytes and might be a little too heavy to send it just via email. So thanks, Lisa. And we have another question by Brittany, and I will read it out because she unfortunately doesn't have a microphone available, it seems. So Brittany's question is, do you have specific recommendations for how to reconcile the disconnect between the state of Alaska's Arctic policy and the broader US national strategy? And maybe my personal addition to that would be the links that sort of President Obama's visit in Alaska provided, and now the Arctic Council chairmanship of the US having ended in May. Do you see sort of the perception also from the lower 49 being changing away from this Arctic interest again? But that's just a follow-up. So the first one would Brittany with the disconnection between the state of Alaska Arctic policy and the US national strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not, none of these are easy questions, right? But I think the prior administration really conflated Arctic and climate change. So I think the recommendation is for the national government, for the U.S. to really think through more strategically and comprehensively about what Arctic means and the different levels or interests embedded within Arctic that, you know, in a lot of ways go well beyond climate change. So I think that, and I don't know that. Well, I think revisiting the national strategy and adding an economic development or sustainable development line of effort would go a long ways towards addressing that. Canada has a Canadian Northern Development Agency. Norway has a Ministry of Regional Development who has an emphasis right now on strengthening their high north. Russia even has changed within its Ministry of Economic Development and its Arctic planning an approach to regional development that you just don't see in the U.S. So something like a U.S. Northern Economic Development Agency would help to maybe pull together or connect with some of the 20 different agencies involved to help direct or at least better frame sustainable development issues in the region. And that apparatus is just lacking right now.
Right.
And then to Arnie, your question about post-U.S. chairmanship, yes, interest will wane. Unless there's a crisis, then which none of us want, then yes, interest will wane. It's going to be, I think, really, I mean, it's always been hard for the rest of the U.S. to think of itself as Arctic. And the way I thought about it is that it's just not important to them because it's not important to the U.S. GDP. So where you see Arctic economic activity as important to a nation's GDP, you see a greater level of interest, coordination, and investment. And in the U.S. case, that's just lacking. So it'll never mean as much to the rest of the U.S. as it does to Alaska. And I don't even know that it should. I think as long as the federal government has the correct mechanism in place to manage its interests and meet the domestic need within the state, then that's a good thing. A lot of there's a Japanese saying, I think, better a friendly neighbor than a distant relative. And I'd much rather see Alaska develop stronger relationships with Canada and Russia or with the rest of the Arctic than trying to convince Georgia that it's an Arctic state.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for that. It's somewhat dark estimate, but yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a somewhat dark outlook, I guess, but also speaking from the issue of climate change, I think it is a challenge with the current U.S. administration to draw their focus on environmental and climate change issues, and whereas the previous administration obviously could use the Arctic and Alaska as an extension as opposed to poster for climate change, this clearly needs a new strategic view again on the federal level, but that's maybe just an external and European point of view. All right, I was reaching out to the audience once more for additional questions, and here's your additional chance with a look towards our timing. I think we're aiming for a spot-on landing. We have roughly almost 10 minutes left, so if there are one or two more questions, I think Nils will be happy to answer, or also if there are questions to our previous presenters, Emily and Katherine. Emily is still with us and would be available to answer any questions you might have on the WWF's project. If you just let me know, it's enough in the question box if you just shout here, then I can see your name and that you have interest in a question, in asking a question, and then unmute you. So I'll just give you that additional chance, and while I'm waiting for replies and additional questions, let me already thank you both or all three of our presenters, Emily and Katherine, and Nils, of course, as well, for your very interesting presentations, for your straightforward approach in answering the range of questions and trying to give a concise overview on each of the difficult questions as well. We very much appreciate it and your time, so thank you for that. And we will try to share the presentation as soon as possible, as well as the recording. Today has been, unfortunately, this technical glitch day that I usually try to avoid at all costs, but unfortunately, even though we prepared it yesterday and had a working test call yesterday and working preparation today, unfortunately it was not able to share the webcam. We will get onto it with our IT team tomorrow and hope to have that fixed very soon, and apparently it seems to be just an update issue from the webinar software. So once we've done that, we look forward to seeing you actually in person again and not just having this call in and radio show. So thank you for being present. Thank you for staying present and being with us for this week's webinar. Once more, the shout out to those who have not yet submitted their abstracts for their contributions to the Arctic Summer College this year. You will have another week to do so, but of course you can do that before. We've already received a couple of questions also regarding the sort of general goalposts of this abstract, if there should be a specific also word count for the final document, for instance, or which topics would be recommendable. I'll reach out again to Max and Brendan as well, and we'll come back to you with some sort of basic understandings, so you'll see your questions and reflected in our answers later this week as well. I don't see any additional questions, so I will call it a day from the Berlin office at least. It's 7:54 p.m. here. So thanks again. Thanks to all participants. Thank you to our experts. It's been a great pleasure to hear your expertise and to be witness to your knowledge and your presentations. Thank you to all participants. See you all next week. And yes, I hope we can. Oh, wait a second. So we have one more question. Just as we read up, Brittany. One more question from Brittany. So Nils, if you bear with us, I think it should be manageable to give a quick response to that. Brittany's asking, do you think that Alaska's perspectives are well represented by the US in the Arctic Council, or if there would be ways to improve this representation? So once more, the sort of mismatch between the federal and the state level and its representation in the Arctic Council.
Yeah. No, it's the easy answer. I think a lot of within the Arctic Council, each of the eight states have approached this differently. The State Department's done a good job of including a State of Alaska representative in many of the meetings and in some of the planning. But I don't know that there's a real direct connection between State of Alaska input into what the U.S. should do or say or participate in or advocate for within the Arctic Council. There's no mechanism really for that, and I think helping to foster something like that would be a good thing. To a large extent, the state often accepts its role as a state, which probably is what it should do. But I think there's any number of different opportunities for the state of Alaska to be more proactive in advocating for its interests in the Arctic region, and including within an Arctic Council context. What that actually means or requires is having the capacity to follow all the Arctic Council meetings, participate in all the projects, and be an active and engaged member of the U.S. Delegation. And it's just between resource constraint and any number of different other competing priorities, that's just not the case. So the state could do more. The State Department could find new ways of including Alaskan input into what it's doing or its interests. Alaska could participate through the Northern Forum and attend kind of doubly. It could also support and be more involved with permanent participants. 4 of the 6 of whom are Alaskan in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of different ways that it could influence the Arctic Council domestically. It could also work more toward bilateral relationships with observer states or other Arctic states. And I think that's something that could be pursued in the coming years.
All right. Thank you once more, Nils, for that comprehensive answer. I will now close the webinar for today, and we look forward to seeing you next week, July 19th, when we have Pamela Less and Sonia Bigford teaching us about environmental impact assessment for the Arctic. Thanks again. Thanks, Nils. Thanks, Emily and Katherine. And see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.